All right, we are now live.
So we should probably do some introductions. I'm Ryan Honeyman, a new partner at Lyft Economy, and this is a series of interviews with some of the Lyft partners about some of the ideas and topics they're most passionate about. So first up, we have Kevin Bayuk, founding member of Lyft Economy, and is going to talk to us a little bit about what is the next economy, what does it look like, and how can we bring it about.
Great, thanks, Ryan.
So
So
yeah,
when
so
I,
Kevin, what is the next economy?
what is the next economy? Which is, I think we use that term because the next economy, there's a lot of different competing ideas and words to describe uh, something that at its heart has some kind of core aspects to it. We've heard people talk about the new economy. We've heard people talk about the impact economy, the generative economy, the green economy, the sustainable economy, the blue economy, uh, and more, the benefit economy. The idea is, what would the economy look like if it actually was working for the benefit of all life? And what that basically means is kind of look at the indicators of the existing economy. The existing economy, um, when you look at the world and you see hunger and thirst and homeless, a billion people without food tomorrow, 800 million without fresh water or improved sanitation, ecosystem collapse on almost every major ecosystem according to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. 400 parts per million plus of CO2 in the atmosphere increasing, global climate change creating climate refugees, war. I mean, all these like terrible symptoms and artifacts. There, it seems to be that there's a tight relationship between those terrible social and ecological problems and the way the economy works and actually how it's designed. And so when we say the next economy, it's possible that nothing short of a redesign of the basic facets of how the economy, the global economy works, will enable us to actually address those major problems in the world and create, not only address the problems, but do it in a way that creates enormous benefit. And so an economy that works for the benefit of all life would be one where you'd imagine all people everywhere for all time have reliable access to their basic needs: food, water, shelter, textiles, comfort, loving relationships, a secure home. Those would be basic for people. And at the same time, imagine people meeting their needs in that way, and having the impact of the way they meet their needs be generative to the environment, where you would have clean air, clean, fresh, available water, biodiversity increasing all over the globe rather than decreasing, um, more beauty, more green, verdant ecologies, more topsoil, more carbon regular carbon cycles, regular hydrologic cycles. So how do you create an economy that achieves those outcomes, social and environmental? What would it look like, and how do you go about doing it from kind of where we're at? I think it's important to maybe assess why the current economy does not achieve those outcomes, and what's kind of structurally wrong or challenged about the current economy. And there's a few things that are really important to, I think, develop a literacy around in order to design an economy that does work for the benefit of all life. Some of the basic things that I think a lot of people don't think about very much has to do with some of the basic components of the economy, especially if we define the economy as the collective set of strategies and means and ways in which people meet their total needs. So a very broad definition of economy, not just some kind of system of transactions. While that system of transactions to meet needs is an important component, if we describe the economy in its total kind of aspect, taking care of the home, the oikos, and how we manage it, then we look at the economy and say, okay, what's wrong with it? Well, one of the big problems is the way that one of the drivers of the economy is the creation of money and currency. And I think a lot of people don't understand how important that is, or how money is created. Specifically, that in general, all over the world, money is created, no matter which region you're in. money is basically created as debt, uh, which in itself is not necessarily problematic per se, but what makes it really challenged is money is interest-bearing debt. Becomes really important to understand why the world is in its sad state of affairs. When you have interest-bearing debt as the creation mechanism for money, it sets into motion a cascade of effects that we see all over the world. One of the effects would be that there's always a need to create more. So if money is loaned into existence and the payback has to come with a certain amount of interest on top of the amount that was loaned out, that amount that has to come back as more has to come from somewhere. And where it actually comes from is from nature. You have to look at natural resources, or forests and oceans and animal systems and so forth. If you can exploit those things, those resources, and take advantage of them to create the interest to pay back on the creation of money, then we create that. Or human connection and community. When we do things for free for each other, gifts that we give to each other, it's not creating more transaction, more money, more interest to be able to pay back the lending as the creation mechanism for money. So if we did stuff for each other for free, like I brought your family over and treated you to dinner and I cooked the dinner, compared to us going out to a restaurant and making a transaction. Making the transaction is important for the economy as it's structured today. So we're motivated to create the transaction instead of me babysitting for your family, you babysitting for my family, and trading it for free or something like that. We're incentivized to find a service that we can pay for as a means for creating additional transactions increasing the GDP, the additional transactions creating more income that is able to pay back the interest on the creation of money. Because when you have, the more has to be created somewhere, so there's essentially not enough for everybody in the way that money is created, which another artifact that is created because of that circumstance is competition. Competition is the basic motive in the existing economy, because there will never be enough by the way that money is created. What's really problematic about that, it should be obvious to everybody, is that if you need to create more and you're on a finite planet, when you begin with an economy like that and you have a planet full of resources and oceans full of fish and forests full of trees, and then topsoils 8 feet deep, then it's not necessarily a big deal. The economy, it works for a while and you can achieve great things. But when you start to reach the limits of nature or the limits of people and connections of what can be transacted, things start to get a bit squirrely. You run into problems of where the problem of food security or diminishing returns has more to do with topsoil than the combine technology. Or if you look at the economy of fisheries, it's actually the number of fish in the ocean that are being harvested. So you're running into hard limits of the abundance of nature's provisioning as being the limiting factors to growth. That's another thing. The economy has to grow. The success metric for the economy, it's not just the metric that's used, it's essential. If you have 1 or 2 quarters of negative GDP, we call it a recession. And I think 4 quarters, I forget the technical definitions, 4 quarters of negative growth in GDP is called a depression. The economy literally, if the depression occurs, right, what happens? Companies lay off people, so there's less jobs, leading to less consumption, which leads to ultimately a reduction in supply, less production, which leads to less consumption, or which leads to more layoffs, which leads to less consumption. So depression theoretically could perpetuate indefinitely without some type of stimulus or response or creation of more available money in different ways, making money less costly. And so the creation of money with a cost of interest on it is extraordinarily problematic to the long-term ability for humans to survive, frankly. And it's totally overlooked, mostly overlooked as being problematic, or most people don't even know about it. The other,
so does something like Bitcoin address that?
not really. Bitcoin is also based on scarcity. The creation of Bitcoin is based on a scarce, finite resource that if you mine faster than the others or whatever, put more resources into it, then you'll accumulate more than the next person. It has some aspects of it that reduce the transaction costs that are kind of part of the problem, if you will, of the creation of money. But Bitcoin in and of itself doesn't necessarily solve the problem. Bitcoin makes transactions easier and takes away a lot of the power of banking itself. But cryptocurrency and the idea of a cryptocurrency could be designed with the right type of design principles to solve some of the major problems around money creation. The big so cryptocurrency and money creation, while money creation is a big problem and it is soluble, and if you're looking for your reference point on that, a good book to read would be Sacred Economics by Charles Eisenstein, if you want some good proposals of actions that humanity can take. But even that, when you talk about money creation and changing that system, it seems that's a big picture thing. And most people, I think, who are consumers or want to have a job, take care of their family. So for most people, it's going to be an abstract idea. Oh, we got to change the way money's created. Okay, what do I do? What am I going to possibly do about that? But I think it's literacy about why it's problematic is important, because there's things that you can do to intervene with some of the systems that get set in place because of that kind of design DNA. Another just to understand it though, growth is required for the economy to work. The economy that's created that way. You have to create more to be able to pay back that interest on debt. So growth is essential. And if growth stops, you end up with depression. That should scare everybody, because again, we live on a finite planet and you actually can't grow the economy. The economy can develop and mature or change, but you can't actually grow the number of transactions infinitely. There's a limited set of resources for which to do that, especially if you define the economy as the way we meet all our needs for food, water, shelter, so forth. And that current economy, that it doesn't work, should be so embarrassingly self-evident to everybody that a next economy is required. Just the state of the world. 1 billion people tomorrow will go hungry when we produce twice the number of calories that people need. I mean, that should make everybody go, what are we doing? As a privileged white person, I could travel in Haiti or the Congo or other places where there is malnutrition and starvation, and I could go there tomorrow and probably be fed. It's not that there's not food there. There are places in the world where there is famine, but in most cases, it's not a scarcity of food. It's an economic problem. It's economic inequity that creates hunger. It's economic inequity that creates thirst and homelessness. And so the structural building blocks of the economy are so far broken that the evidence that it's broken should be apparent. It also, another artifact that people should understand is planned obsolescence. When we build things, we build them as crap. We build them not to last and create waste and more resources, because that means more transactions, more GDP, more ability to pay back the interest on the money creation that's put into existence as lending with interest. So you have this kind of cascading set of problems related to the way money is created. And that's just one aspect. You'd say another major underpinning aspect of is the asset class known as land. The way that land is actually owned and its value is not taxed or recognized. So real estate as a whole asset class as a percentage of total global GDP is enormous. Land is the predominant asset, if you will, that enables and perpetuates income inequities. And without structural changes to the way land tenure is designed, the way land is either taxed or held either in commons or some type of different form of ownership, conveying the rights of ownership without having it be owned, without changing that, I'm afraid without changing the way money is created and without changing the way land is owned, humanity will kill itself. And take down an enormous amount of the biodiversity on the planet with it in very short order. So those are big problems. But again,
there for a question. So, there's research that things like the whole "Angels of Our Better Nature" book about like violence is actually decreasing, violence against women is decreasing. All these metrics that are constantly in the news about how everything's going to explode are actually hyperbole compared to what's the data is showing in some areas, maybe not like climate change.
So socially, right. So socially, yes, we have some good data on things about violence. But environmentally, there's nothing that the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment prior to the IPCC, chartered by the UN, was the largest scientific study ever undertaken around the turn of the century. And it showed every single major ecosystem on the planet in radical decline. IPCC shows, a current trend towards 450 parts per million, which conservative estimates suggest 50% biodiversity loss on the planet, 200 million climate refugees by the year 2050. I mean, the environmental outcomes are frightening. I should say there's not no positive environmental stuff. There are some contrarian and good contrarian voices that point out some of the conservation efforts are effective, which I think should be hopeful that there's techniques and strategies that we can employ as humanity to address that. But the big barrier to implementing a lot of those techniques and strategies is the fear and the honest truth, the fear that will forestall the economy and create unemployment. And they're right. It's like, oh, we shouldn't do that because that's going to hurt the economy. It's true. It's true. It is going to hurt the economy because of the way the economy is designed, not because that it has to be that way, right?
So let's talk solutions then. So what does that redesign enable us to slow down on this kind of finite path?
Right. Well, so so the thing that bothered me for so long is that once you kind of come to some basic observations that the economy as it exists is structurally broken, it doesn't work for the benefit of people or planet, and that the structural changes that would be required go to some of the deepest, most embedded systems, how money is created and how land is owned. I mean, these are big issues. And again, from an individual's perspective, you sit there in the apartment thinking, well, how can I possibly work to solve these seemingly intractable issues? And I think a lot of people go through that. One pathway to start moving yourself into a place of responsibility and action is to say, okay, where do I have agency and what are the things that I can do, even if they're incremental? If you calculate the problem as being larger than yourself, what in Lyft jargon sometimes we say, the transition to the next economy is like a 500-year journey. It might take a long time. The problem is larger than ourselves. So what can we do to incrementally, with our own, where we have agency, move the needle, if you will, towards creating that economy that does work for the benefit of all life? And so you start working down to, okay, what are the possible things that are happening now, the solutions that I can support and enable and create that are moving in that direction to create if the conditions right now, if it's impossible or unlikely to change the way money is created or change the way land is owned, what are the possible solutions that I can enable now that will then later create those conditions where those, then at that point, then it's easier to contemplate the idea of making the larger corrections. So there's a few things. First, I want to talk about the personal level, because everybody, no matter what level they're in, whether they're an entrepreneur, starting a business, running a business, or whatever, everybody has a role to play in the transition, if you will, to the next economy. And I think the most important thing is a little bit more literacy, is to understand how the principles behind indigenous economies, people who have lived in place for 8,000, 10,000, 14,000, or 5,000 years, wherever they are on the planet. Indigenous economy is built on a couple of concepts that I think are really important to think of as principles. One of the ideas is this idea that for a lot of basic needs in indigenous economies are met through what we would call the gift economy. So the gift economy, the idea that I have food, you need food, I give you food. You have skills to build shelter, I need a shelter, you come and you help me build a shelter. It's a very critical kind of trust-based economy.
Is that trade or gift?
Not trade, not trade. We would call it gift. You would call it gift. Gift would be the word we would use for it. Another, if you wanted to use more elaborate words, you'd call it the implicit reciprocity economy. There's no trade at the time of transaction. You came and you helped me. You pay it forward. You helped me build my house. I didn't give you anything. What's important to recognize is that it didn't tend to, even in indigenous cultures, this was something that was either bound to the village or the tribe or very close-in relationships. The only place it really exists in the affluent world today, in the West, if you will, is in the family. The mother provides a meal for the children without any cost. Is there a reciprocity the way families treat each other? It would be implicit. There's no explicit kind of like accounting for, hey, I fed you 1,200 lunches over the last few years. You owe me something else. Why don't you trade out doing some yard work for me or something? Nobody accounts for it that way. So the gift economy is functional only when trust is built, and in a large part, we don't trust each other. The second, though, there is an important component. The second kind of ring, if you will, of transactions is what we would call it barter or trade, and that was really important. This is currency-less transactions. I fix shoes, you have bananas. I need bananas, you need your shoes fixed. Two very dissimilar goods or services, and they're traded. No currency is exchanged, and which again allows us to avoid all the problematic nature of money creation whatsoever. No money needed to be created. The value of the transaction was established between you and I at that moment, which requires trust. Usually knowing the person that you're trading with is really important, because what if your bananas suck? Or what if I really am crappy at fixing shoes? Then you're going to give me less bananas or whatever. So knowing the value of the exchange, the barter or the trade is really important. So it really is a relationship-based economy. So gift and barter made up the predominant majority of most indigenous, economies. Currency was still used in indigenous. It's existed for a long time. I think David Graeber wrote a book about like debt 5,000 years or something like that. Currency is very old. There was usually a kind of a polyculture of different types of currencies. It was either shells, beads, seeds, notches and sticks, giant rocks. I mean, all these different types of currencies were used, even precious metals, even, hemp paper tickets with dead white people on them. It's a weird, currency is a weird thing, and it's been around for a long time, but the current currency was used in indigenous economy for rarer transactions where trust was not required. It's like the coastal people come to the inland with salt, and the inland peoples would purchase the salt with some type of currency. Currency in that role, money plays, the role is, it's an agreement. It's a value agreement. We think that this money is worth whatever it is. And that agreement is what makes the money valuable. It's what makes it work. So this many beads or shells as an acknowledgement of this exchange could be used somewhere else. So another way you could look at the current economy is that the currency, because of this creation that requires interest on top of the debt, is subsuming all the barter and gift. All the trade and gift that we used to do as people, humanity, for thousands of years is being subsumed by currency transactions. So if you're looking for a way out, or how can I help build the next economy today in my life, even if I don't start a company or try and create a new mechanism for creating money, the way you can do that is to provide gifts to people you trust, create trust in your community, in your neighborhood, share resources without reciprocity, build trusting relationships, barter and trade in your community or amongst people that you know. Anything that's a cashless exchange to help you meet your needs, so a gift or a barter or a trade, it's a small, it's like, I know it's like just a pebble or a grain of sand on the beach, but every single transaction that you don't do via currency, it simultaneously kind of like chips away at the GDP, which kind of hastens the collapse of the economy that is destroying the planet and people. But it also, I think, simultaneously does something really important. It prepares us for when that economy does not work. When it's self-evident that when the economy goes into, say, a global depression and things are really bad, if you have a strong network of people that you trust and you trade with, and they trust and trade with you and give you gifts and you give them gifts, you're more likely to be resilient in your kind of community or neighborhood when the large economy kind of collapses. So you're better prepared to be able to handle the circumstance of effective chronic unemployment or whatever the circumstance might be, because you have a network of support. So while that's kind of a hard thing to do for some people because of the social dynamics of the affluent world, that's something that every single person can take part in, is like, how can I give gifts, or how can I trade or barter rather than use currency for my needs? So just make a list of the things that you need, babysitting, food, clothes or whatever. And it's like, if we could do clothing swaps for clothes, if we can do
Is this like Yordle, but it's like Yordle for basic human needs or something?
It is, yeah. And so Yordle is like a diverse set of goods, and there's a number of other, local exchange trading systems, or time banking would be on the barter kind of trade kind of scale things. The gift economy is as simple as like having people over for a potluck rather than going to a restaurant. Mm-hmm. Each one of those things, there's technologies that are trying to help enable them. The one thing that's key about the technologies to know if they're going to be successful or not, though, is those economies of gift and barter and so forth. Even Craigslist and FreeCycle are actually really helpful, but for those things to work, I think it's discounted a little bit too much. For those things to work, trust has to be there, and trust and relationship. So if the technology creates trust and relationship, that's great. If the technology just helps enable the trade or barter or gift, I guess it's better than not. But it's not going to, because the fundamental piece that makes that economy important is actually the trust and relationship between people. So I think the Yordle and these
maybe like customer reviews on something like Yelp are sort of the proxy for trust.
Yeah, sure. And so, technology they are, right? And technology should help with trust and identity. Those are things that technology can help with. What I would advocate for is that those are also kind of poor proxies for knowing the people who are close to you. Just knowing your neighbors and seeing, if you look at everybody who lives in the affluent world, who lives on a block or has a set of neighbors, if you looked at the 100 closest people who live close to you and said, what do they have in terms of skills for service provision or goods that I need, and what do I have that I could offer up to them? 100 people who live near you, if you live in one of these affluent world cities, it's an enormous amount of potential for exchange of cashless kind of provision of goods and services. And you could take that, if you were bold, you could take that all the way up and say, hey, I have a need for housing. What can I do to trade for my rent? I have a need for, look at all your expenses. I have a need for healthcare. What could I do to trade or barter or gift in terms of, the healthcare? Even the highest needs, I mean, and I'm not making it up. People do those kind of things. I know people currently who live where their rent expense is covered through a trade or barter. So you could take it as far as you want, or you could just start with I'm going to do a share care system with other parents for childcare, which would be awesome. That's a cashless, currency-less barter exchange kind of trade program. Or I could start a potluck for my neighbors once a month. Awesome. So just to say, like, the creation of the next economy, if it's a 500-year problem, everybody has a role to play today to do at least in one thing. It's, create more gifts or more barter or exchanges. And then, yes, there are businesses to support those things. Okay, but that's still so esoteric for some people, okay, there's things I can do today. The economy at large is broken. It's destroying the planet. It's creating tremendous amounts of suffering for people in terms of hunger and so forth. Those problems are still getting worse. The economy at large. Okay, but money creation and land ownership, those are the problems. Okay, I can't do anything about those. Okay, yeah, I can host a potluck. I can do a clothing share or swap. Great. But what else can we do today? Well, there's a huge category which I would be doing it an injustice if I said there's like a less bad approach to doing business. If you roll your mind forward and say, what would that economy look like if currency was created in a way that was generative? What would the economy look like? There's other aspects to the economy that have happened because of the quite rapacious or business as usual approach to generating fossil fuel energy and making it cheap and exploiting people and planet. The artifacts of that kind of exploitation of the supply chain, making things cheap, is that we have a business kind of growth pattern where businesses are growing to be multinationals and accruing and accreting in size and accruing wealth that becomes concentrated into fewer and fewer stakeholder hands. There's 85 billionaires of the world have more wealth than 3.5 billion poorest. So almost half the world's people have less wealth than 85 individuals. About 2,000 billionaires on the planet. I mean, it's an embarrassing artifact of a system gone wrong. And the multinational corporations in the public equity markets, in the trading transactions of the systems of the economy, kind of perpetuate that. So when somebody starts a business today, and if a business is considered successful, it's because it's grown to be a multinational. It's scaled and grown large, and it produces more and more earnings, and more earnings potential creates a higher value stock price, which creates more wealth, which gets distributed to fewer and fewer people. So you have this like cascading set of problems related to that. So what would an economy look like in terms of the types of organizations for the provision of goods and services if the economy were working? If we fix the currency and the land problem, what kind of businesses would there be? Well, they would look like regional businesses that work within the bioregion, try and supply as much of their supply chain within their region, and do their supplies, the goods that they create. When we create clothing or human needs, basic human needs, and homes and all the materials that go into homes. But you could define basic human needs even into technology, like a smartphone. What goes into a smartphone? So you can define needs in a broader sense, or ceramics, or anything. How can you create those goods regionally and at the base of the supply chain, create them so that when you're harvesting wood for wooden homes, you're actually doing it in a way that increases the biodiversity and the water holding capacity and the carbon sequestration of the forest, rather than destroying the forest. So
like this net positive movement is
net positive. Yeah, so net positive. So businesses that are net positive, working within the region, owned by people in the region, providing goods for people in the region. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be any global or interregional trade. There is natural comparative advantages. Bananas grow in the tropics. We'd be silly to put up, glass houses all over the world to have bananas grown regionally. It's a great thing that in the tropics we can have coffee and bananas can be traded outside. And similarly, there's woodlands where there's wood that's grown that could be utilized around the world in places where there's grasslands and rangelands that don't have as much wood. There's basic comparative advantage. There's always going to be trade, and I think that's a great thing. But for most human needs, we can probably, in most cases, if you use indigenous people as a model, produce most human needs within a particular bioregion. So these type of basically smaller companies than the global multinationals that treat the earth well and treat their people really well, the people working within the company, so that companies take on a role of being not just some kind of organization that is run in some kind of command control militaristic type of model that subjugates people into 90,000 hours. That's the number of hours we usually spend in an average Western person's life working in a company. The 90,000 hours of your life being subjected to competition and feeling that you don't like what you do. The number of people who are dissatisfied with the work that they do in the workplace is enormous. The statistics out there are just embarrassing and frightening, really, that people are, I can't believe there's not more mental disease. I know there's a lot, but just how people can spend their some significant portion of their life doing things that they don't like and feeling terrible about it. So businesses that are organizations that are almost like incubators for human development. So like that actually people feel alive when they're at work and they're actually contributing to each other and learning how to make decisions together and feeling enriched and fulfilled with what they're doing to provide goods and services for other people. And of course, the way in which they're creating those goods and services is net positive or beneficial to the environment in terms of biodiversity, topsoil, carbon cycle, hydrologic cycle, all the things that are necessary to create conditions conducive to life. Okay, so that would be a next economy, would be businesses that are organized that way to have impact externally that's beneficial and have impact internally with the people who are working in those organizations. And so that's something we don't have to wait for to change how money is created, and we don't have to wait until land ownership models change in order to create those organizations. And I'm super enthusiastic, and Lyft is super enthusiastic about that, because when you look at what's possible out there, what our observation is some of those companies already exist. Thank goodness.
Yeah, who are some of the companies that you would say are living this ideal?
South Mountain Company would come to mind, the highest scoring B Corp, as an organization that has fully digested and embedded the concepts of how can we be net positive in the way we build homes, be as beneficial and energy efficient as possible in terms of, and maybe they even have further to go there to create passive homes or living buildings. But they also, the way they treat their people as a human development organization, where they have actually created their own co-housing community for people to live in. They build homes for all their workers, how they contribute from their profits to a number of different methods to actually contribute back to society from any of the profits that they give. And of course, operating as a worker-owned cooperative, so that the workers are the owners, involved in the decision-making and practicing democracy in their everyday lives. The way these people come out of that organization to operate in their communities as citizens, they're skilled, highly skilled in how to make collective decision-making with others, which are skills that the world needs. So that's an organization that's successful, maybe growing to, I think, maybe 70 or 100 people. I forget how many people they have, but it's a modest-sized regional organization. But if every builder on the planet who is building homes was designed according to that pattern, because everywhere where homes are built, which is pretty much everywhere, so you need a builder or building organizations. Well, there's a model right there that if replicated everywhere, would be incredibly beneficial to all human life. So you have an organization that's modeled like that. Three Stone Hearth would be another one that comes to mind in Berkeley, California, community-supported kitchen. Prior to learning about DPOs, they did a community financing of the community-supported kitchen. It's 45 employees, 17 worker owners. Everybody else who is an employee has a pathway to ownership. It sources food locally from the local food shed for seasonal, nutrient-dense, high-quality food produced in a kitchen, where they offer cookery trainings to people, to their customers, if their customers don't want to buy from them. So prepared meals, nutrient-dense meals, packaged in reusable glass packaging, which comes at great expense and comes at a cost to their profit margin. Used to be distributed by Bayuk. I think there's drop-off spots and other distribution methods now. But it's become a profitable and sustainable going concern of an organization that not only does it do well externally by taking goods from the local farmers, providing livelihood for those farmers who are doing well for Earth in terms of their practices, so highly ethical in their supply chain, providing employment opportunities and educational opportunities to create high nutrition food, distributing it in a responsible way, sustainable way. And what I love about them is also their organization is designed as a deliberately developmental organization. They're taking on practices to how can you use the organization essentially as a human development, organic growth container. How can people develop themselves to be more autonomous?
Using those 90,000 hours for developing positive outcomes for their employees.
Exactly. Yeah, positive outcomes for their employees. And then what I love of them, how can we create the kitchen model so that every community everywhere could have a community supported kitchen? So those are just a couple of examples of organizations that I think, and I could talk about more, and maybe that's another topic that we can go into, is what are the organizations that we hold out as some kind of ideal models.
And also what's the effects of the price parity paradox of these? Like, how do companies that consider all those things compete with, Munchery?
Yes, and so that's a good example. So like the price parity paradox, or the PPP, is this concept that when you are one of these regional businesses that are very ethical in how you work in your supply chain, if you're provisioning goods or even services, how you treat people, and then within your company itself, how you treat your employees. If you're investing in those things to be regenerative and beneficial, your cost of doing business is higher than the business as usual economy, the alternative. And because we're talking about human needs are being met by the economy in terrible ways, but they're being met. And so there is typically, for almost all these new organizations that are being started or grown, there's an alternative that exists in the business as usual economy. And that business as usual economy, because of the motivations of the system that we've described, are typically exploiting people and planet, so their cost of delivering their goods and services lower. And so when it comes to the marketplace, one of the tragedies, and South Mountain Company suffers from this, is one of the tragedies is because they have all these costs embedded. Usually these green, sustainable, ethical companies, these B Corps, have to service a premium marketplace. They have to charge more for their goods. And only a certain small segment of the affluent world can actually afford to invest in themselves that way. The low-cost market will pay a 15%. The conscious consumer will pay a 15% premium, but that assumes that these conscious consumers have the disposable income to invest in that way. And so the goods that should do good for the earth become inaccessible to large marketplaces. So the question is, how can you address this price parity paradox? How can you bring the prices of these goods and services at some type of parity or very close to the business as usual alternative? And there's different approaches. So one is the idea of volume. Is oftentimes if you're just starting one of these ethical companies and you don't have enough volume, of production, your costs are going to be higher. But there is a natural economy of scale that might be achieved at a certain volume where you can start to achieve price parity with the exploitation economy. It totally depends on the region and totally depends on the good, but volume and scale. And so sometimes actually financing or providing capital for these organizations so that they can reach a certain scale becomes the most important way for them to address the paradox. Another way is actually to have the consumers be the owners. So cooperative consumption, if the consumers of the goods and services are the investors and actually are owners in the company, they will pay the premium because they will actually be returned the premium back as part of their ownership. As the company becomes a going concern and grows, they stand in a position to actually take some of the profits from the collective consumption of everybody back to, if you will, back into their own pocket. So having the consumers of direct public offerings and unaccredited investment models and so forth are ways to have more accessible price parity paradox addressment. Another possible way is if there's innovation in the supply chain. If investing in the supply chain to change the practices in the supply chain to lower, again, it becomes a volume play. If you can lower the costs in the supply chain, then you can ultimately bring your part of the supply, your part of the value chain. If you're already running at that higher cost than the business as usual economy might not be investing in the supply chain. So sometimes either vertically integrating or investing in the supply chain to reduce the variable cost of your goods would be a way to reduce the overall price that the consumer or the ultimate buyer. Another would be invest in innovation to reduce overhead. So the business as usual economy sometimes have they won't invest in innovation because there's already kind of a expectation of a certain margin that's put out to, especially if it's a publicly traded company. And so the research and development to invest in innovation to reduce their prices is sometimes they're not motivated to do that, especially if there's a semi-monopoly position. And so I've seen this happen a few times in the sustainability realm, as companies can invest in innovation, which will reduce their overhead or reduce their variable costs. Sharing overhead, Zingerman's be an example of a group of organizations, a family of organizations or a community of organizations that are able to reduce their overhead, which they could pass through to a reduction in price, even though they invest more in other aspects of their business, in their supply chain or in their operations, because they share overhead, they share their accounting function with multiple businesses. So any group of companies can share their overhead almost as a producer cooperative or a supplier cooperative will help address the price parity paradox. Another key one is reducing the salaried overhead through total compensation. So looking at and a number of B Corps and ethical companies face this. They actually offer lower salaries than their competitors, but their the benefit of their work environment, because of the investments they make in human development, are their total compensation, the total package of what it means to work for these organizations with meaning and purpose built in, and flex time and other things enables them to lower their overhead or variable costs, depending on what kind of labor there is, by looking at total compensation. And another method is to have worker ownership. So one thing that the business as usual economy leaves on the table is if they concentrate earnings and have, for example, very inflated executive salaries that are 30 to 300x the lowest person's salary. If you use a worker-owned cooperative model where the decision-making, if the decision-making results, and it doesn't have to, but results in a more equitable banding of compensation and spreading the compensation out through the organization, you might capture some savings that you could pass through to addressing the price parity paradox. And the final one that I'd add for the price parity paradox is this idea of transparency. Sometimes you can, as a company that wants to be fully ethical, you could say, and we source this good from this less ethical place. Why? Because that enables us to price it at parity with the business as usual comparable. But we're going to be transparent about it. We're going to tell you that that's
Patagonia, and then them saying kind of, and we're going to improve in these ways.
And we're going to improve in these ways, and we want to work on it. And that would be Patagonia. It's spot on. It's like we're not as good as we want to be. We're as good as we can be, and that's why, in order to be able to, if we produced all of our high tech garments domestically through local cut and sew factories, a jacket would cost $10,000. And we don't do that. We offer our jacket for $100 because we make sacrifices in what our ethics are in the supply chain. But we're not going to hide it from you. We're not going to lie about it. We're not going to obfuscate it. We're going to tell you about it. So that's the transparency trade-off. So those are the 8 ways that we've conceived of to address the price parity paradox. Well, Ryan, it's about 1:30. But I think we got through a couple pieces of it. Let me make sure I have my next hangout appointment. Yeah, I have to drop in 1 minute. So.
Sure. Well, thank you. And I think what we should probably do is pick up on this notion of how can these next economy companies kind of take the next step, because I think that's where we are now, is like we're starting to address some of these topics, and then it's like, what's the next step for people who are watching this and want to actually take their business to that next economy level?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a number of topics exactly about what do those companies, what are the practices and transition strategies for those companies? How can they finance themselves? How can they have impact externally? What does it mean to work in their supply chain, to invest in it so that it is net positive? How can they create more impact internally? What are the cultural and operational practices? I think those are the topics. That is, of course, what the work that Lyft does, but I'd be happy to share about those, maybe with less construction in the background.
All right, Kevin. Well, thanks again. Enjoy your next call.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for the test. So what I'll do with this is I will share it with you, the video. We can watch it. It'll be private, I think. And then I'll also test the idea of downloading the MP3 as a podcast. And I also want to test the idea of editing the video. So
great. Yeah, please share it. I mentioned to see the quality.
Great.
Cool.
All right. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks. Bye.